I just would like to welcome you to our Janki Foundation Annual Lecture. We've just had our AGM, which has been fairly short and sweet. And one of the main pieces of news that we wanted to share with people was that we have changed our name. Before, we used to be the Janki Foundation for Global Healthcare, and we felt that was a little non-specific, and we wanted people to have a clearer idea of what we were really about. So after careful consideration, we've now changed it to, as you can see, Janki Foundation for Spirituality in Healthcare. And as I'm sure you're all aware, we're connected to the Brahma Kumaris, which is a spiritual organisation, spiritual university, and the ethos of the Brahma Kumaris really does inform the Janki Foundation. But the Janki Foundation is slightly different. It was set up as a separate charity specifically to support the work of the hospital in India at our headquarters. And that's an interesting hospital because it does try and deliver what we would call an integrated model of care, which doesn't just use allopathic and Western medicine, but also uses Ayurveda and different alternative medicines, and also the spiritual aspect of health and caring. So the official description of the Janki Foundation now, and we've thought about, so it's clearer, we can position ourselves more clearly and people know what it is that we're offering and what we're aspiring to. So it's a UK charity promoting spirituality in healthcare. Great advances in the field of medicine on the physical level have led to ever-increasing demands on the health services, but at the expense of a more human-centred ethic and practice. The Foundation acknowledges the central role of positive thoughts and feelings, compassion and kindness in maintaining well-being and preventing illness. Through publications, experiential learning, talks and networking, the Foundation provides opportunities to further such approaches among individuals and professions. It gives regular financial support to the hospital in Rajasthan that has pioneered a healthcare model combining modern medical technology with spirituality and complementary medicine. So the JF is supported by donations and all events are free and voluntary contributions are welcomed. So I think that gives you an idea of who we are and what we're trying to achieve. And so this lecture is part of that, and it's got quite a provocative title, I think. Good use you are not your brain. Yes, you've just reminded me. Could you all please turn your mobile phones off? That's you needn't feel bad. You just acted as a good prompt for the rest of us to turn our phones to silent or off. Okay. So I've been asked to just check with you who's attending a Janki Foundation event for the first time. Just put up your hands, just so we can see. Good. And we'd just like to have an idea of how you found out about this event. So, did you find out about it from email? 3 or 4 people. Post? No one uses post these days. Website? Couple? Family, friend, work, personal contact? Yeah, a lot of people. I think that covers all the categories, so we can see. There will be some photographs being taken of the proceedings. It's probably more likely to be of people on the stage, but there may be some audience shots. So if you feel uncomfortable with that, please just let the photographer or Bhavna or one of the ushers know. So getting back to the topic of good news, you are not your brain. That's a pretty radical statement, really, I think, is that in healthcare these days, because everything is geared towards us being bodies and being brains. But I have to confess, personally, I was always a bit suspicious of thinking I was a brain. And When I was a medical student, because you do this as medical students, you are given a whole body and you can actually cut it up and look at the brain, and it's quite graphic. But I couldn't ever see, or I never had it properly explained to me, how, even through all the neurotransmitters and all the connections, you know, they could say this part of the brain's for language, this part of the brain's for sight, this part of the brain is for hearing, this one does your emotions, this is your memory. But how does it all come together? How come you don't experience yourself as a kind of fragmented kind of mosaic, but you actually have an experience, a unitary experience of being present in the now and integrated? And there's no neurochemical or neurological explanation of how that actually happens. And I think also for me, I remember, and I'm sure you've all had this experience, when you look at through the eyes of a baby or a young child, and you can see that's an old soul. You know, they've brought so much with them. They're not just sort of blank brains. There's a lot more going on there. And that personality, that character, something is coming through very powerful, and you can feel that. And the same with people at the other end of life, with dementia. I've had many experiences with older people where you think, you know, their brain isn't working properly, that's very clear, they can't speak, their memory's going, but there's still very much a strong personality, there's a person in there. So what is that? So I'm really grateful to Neville, because Neville's a journalist in the true sense, I think. You're a seeker of truth. And your career, even before you became a meditator, Neville, was to try and uncover the truth of the situation, and that's a passion of yours. So Neville's worked as a journalist, Sunday Times and other leading newspapers in the UK, really trying to get to the heart of the matter. And yet, I think over 30 years ago now, he really became interested in spirituality, but also as a journalist who was interested in medicine and science, has never lost that curiosity about how those two worlds meet and how they explain each other or how they interact. So I think we're very lucky to have Neville with us tonight to really share with us his exploration of this topic about what's going on with consciousness, and through his exploration of science and where science is at these days as well. And we've heard a lot now about quantum mechanics and neuroplasticity and how thoughts can act at a distance, and how does healing work, you know, how do all those kind of things happen. And so to try and join those dots up, I think, is what I can see Neville is doing. He's really an explorer and someone who's trying to make sense of the whole picture and how those things relate. So I'd like to invite you, Neville, to come up and share with us your exploration of this topic and your musings.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much, Sarah, for that very helpful introduction. Because yes, this is a challenging topic, and I'm still exploring it. I can't in any way say that everything's clear in my head. It isn't, but I've been quite excited at seeing the possibility of a really big scientific revolution, with the realization that the materialistic model is good up to a point, but limited. And there's a lot of work going on which really says we need something, we need a different paradigm. And in fact, a word has been given to this called post-materialist science, which rather appeals to me because it kind of still sounds like science, you know, rather than that you're throwing science out of the window. You're not. But the scientific method can be applied to deeper dimensions than the purely material. And that's what this talk will be about. The whole story isn't there, and as you'll hear, the vast majority of scientists still are wedded to the materialistic paradigm, which says that the mind is an emergent property of the brain. And this, I have to confess right from the start that that this title, Good News, You Are Not My Brain, in fact I think we confessed this on the leaflet, it came from an article in the Huffington Post, published a couple of years back, by Deepak Chopra, who's an MD, and Dr. Rudolf Tanzi, who is Can we see the first slide, please? He's Professor of Neurology at Harvard Medical School. And as they said in this article, the assumption shared by 99% of neuroscientists is that we are our brains. So you can see why this is a very challenging title. Next slide, please.
Let's move forward to the outline.
Oh, right. Sure, yeah. Does that do it? Oh, good, thank you. Okay, thanks. Yeah. And I've got a better view of Sarah as well. Which is nice.
Lucky you.
Actually, Sarah was saying, why do I need to sit up there? And I asked if she could stay there because I get a bit heady sometimes. And if that happens, she will kind of gently say, Neville, what on earth do you mean by that? You know? So flaws in this reasoning that we are our brains, just summarised in that article in the Huffington Post by these two very major experts. Firstly, brain activity isn't the same as thinking, feeling or seeing. Sarah mentioned this aspect of the unity of experience, but even just something like the colour red. If you had a Martian who arrived on this planet and he didn't happen to have visual equipment as part of his sensory data, you could explain to him how photons hit a surface, and if the surface is of a particular kind, it only reflects light of a particular wavelength, and then that particular wavelength hits the retina, and it produces some effects in the brain, and eventually reaches the person who is the kind of recipient of all that information, who sees red. And he'd say, okay, fine, I understand you all the way through to what red is, but what on earth is red? All that mechanism, he still wouldn't have a clue about the experience of red. So there really is a massive difference between what may be going on in the brain, whirring electrical circuits, chemical transmitters, etc., but that is not the same as the experience of thinking, feeling or seeing. Secondly, these two experts pointed out no one has remotely shown how molecules, the brain, acquire the qualities of the mind. No, not remotely. A huge amount of progress in neuroscience, with thanks to modern scanning techniques, which can be really useful, showing different parts of the brain and the different levels of activity in different parts of the brain. The scanning techniques allow certain parts to light up when they're active, and there's a darkness when they're inactive. And this is very useful diagnostically. If there's damage to different parts of the brain, it's very, very helpful to scientists and doctors. But despite huge efforts and more detail about brain functioning, still not the faintest idea how the qualities of the mind emerge from this material complexity. So yes, thirdly, it's impossible to construct a theory of the mind based on material objects that somehow became conscious. And they pointed out that in this consciousness-based view of things, which says that the brain is secondary to the mind, and more on that in a moment, when the brain lights up, it's like a radio becoming active when music is played. The radio did not compose the music. So these are some sort of simple objections to that assumption by the 99% of neuroscientists who think that we are our brains. But moving on, one of the very big benefits of modern neuroscience has been to show that our brains are plastic. Sarah mentioned this concept of neuroplasticity, as it's known technically. They really do change according to every thought and feeling that we have. And if we could move on a slide, please. It used to be thought that after childhood, the brain hardly changes except to decline in old age. But now it's very clear that it changes absolutely all the time. You can give a group of miserable people scans that show that the right frontal cortex, there are some groups of neurons associated with depressed feelings. They're more active than average. than the average person in a group of depressed feelings and a group of people with depressed feelings. And it's been shown that just a short course of mindfulness meditation was enough to downgrade the activity in those misery neurons and upgrade a parallel group of millions of neurons which are associated with happiness and positivity. So that the brain is correlated with our feelings and our thoughts, but what we're suggesting, and the science that I'm presenting tonight is suggesting, is that the brain is not the cause of these feelings and thoughts. The brain is more like something that reflects secondarily what is coming to it from another source. So the question is, what is that? But that's what we'll go into. Next slide, please. There was a very good review of neuroplasticity in this phenomenon in this book called The Brain That Changes Itself by a New York psychiatrist. And but it was all sorts of useful insights that he came up with, and little slogans that the brain scientists have developed, like neurons that fire together, wire together. So if you have a person whose face some neurons are associated with recognizing, and there are feelings of dread or love associated with that face, those two different parts of the brain will wire together so that next time you see that face, those feelings will come up. All these kind of detailed things that they're coming up with, immensely ingenious and informative. But the title of the book betrays a big mistake: The Brain That Changes Itself. Next slide, please. Norman Doidge, the author, says, well, we've yet to understand how thoughts change brain structure, but it's clear that they do. So by calling it the brain that changes itself, he's stuck in this old paradigm that thinks that the brain is the origin of your experience, of your mind, of you, in a sense. And that is where what we're going to question. We're building up the case against that tonight. I started to mention post-materialist science. There was a conference 2 or 3 years ago in Tucson, Arizona, of people from across the world who have been doing work in this field and who feel, rather like Sarah suggested, but they've been pulling together a lot of evidence in this area, that it doesn't make sense to think that I am my brain. There's too much data pointing to phenomena that don't fit that model, like telepathy, like remote viewing, like poltergeist phenomena, all sorts of different things that challenge it, which have just been swept aside as odd by the mainstream because of its adherence to the materialistic science view. But post-materialism says we're not rejecting materialism. It's given us all sorts of useful insights into how the world works, but we need something more than that. Next slide, please. One of the key papers that Deepak Chopra and Rudolf Tanzi cited in their article was this one, Conscious Realism and the Mind-Body Problem. Doesn't mean much to you, I'm sure. It's a pretty technical paper. It's published in a scientific journal, and the author, Donald Hoffman, is Professor of Cognitive Sciences at the University of California at Irvine, really distinguished character in his field. And in this paper, he says at the outset that despite substantial efforts by many researchers, we still have no scientific theory of how brain activity can create or be conscious experience. And he's saying in his paper that that's because we're looking at it the wrong way round. We've been trying to show that, or discover how the brain creates conscious experience. He offers a scientific argument, very detailed and technical, and actually testable mathematically, he claims, that consciousness is the objective reality in this world. Consciousness is the ground of being. Consciousness is the real phenomenon, the irreducible reality. And the material world is a product of consciousness, including our brains. This is a huge leap for anyone to make, and let alone if you're a professor of brain science who's worked with a different paradigm all your life. But for all of us it's difficult because the world seems so tangible, and it doesn't seem as if we're putting it in place. It seems as if the these tables and chairs have a permanence that means that they're there regardless of what consciousness thinks about them. But this different paradigm says differently from that, and I'm going to be going right into this. Next slide, please. What Donald Hoffman argues very strongly in this paper is that we are all conscious agents. That's the term he uses. I suppose it would be the equivalent in spiritual language that we're souls. But he's putting this forward as a scientific proposal, that we're conscious agents, that is, units of consciousness. He's suggesting that there is a mind-like quality to the entire universe, which I'm just wondering if that's a message that I need to take into account. Is that all right there? Am I talking too fast?
No, you're fantastic.
I'm doing all right.
I think you've got us all on board. It's just to let us know that there are 50 people on the webcast.
Oh, good. Okay.
So apart from this audience, hello everyone at home.
Oh, good. You see how insecure I am.
I'm with you. I think, so far we're with you, Neville.
Great.
So keep going.
Lovely. Thanks, Sarah. I really appreciate your reassurance. I really do. So what he's arguing is that as conscious agents, we're part of a deep reality, which is consciousness itself, that there is a mind-like quality to the universe, which is putting in place, split second by split second, the material world that we experience. As David Bohm, a professor of physics who was one of the pioneers of quantum theory, said, it's as if the universe is creating a giant mirror with which to see itself, except that he kind of calling it the universe rather than consciousness as such. But this is the nature of this paper. It's technical. It's actually quite tricky. He goes into some detail with his hypothesis and includes within it an idea that the material world is really like rather like icons on a computer desktop. You know, if you take your mouse and there's a little arrow and you click it on an icon and you drag that icon to the recycle bin, and the recycle bin may open and you drop it in. Well, none of that has actually happened. You behave as if that's a reality, but actually what you're really doing is triggering a complex computing operation that is completely behind the scenes. And that computing operation is made easy for you to follow by the cleverness of this user interface, as they call it. The computer has been made so that you can perform that operation without knowing how computers work at all. And he's arguing that something similar is going on with this world, that mind has a very complex web of machinery behind the scenes, which it then kind of has shaped into this material reality that we experience, rather as a user interface, rather than the kind of tangible reality that we all think of it as normally. So next slide, please. Professor Hoffman writes, consciousness has always been fundamental and matter derivative, the picture of an evolving, unconscious universe of space-time, matter, and fields that over billions of years fitfully gives birth first to life, then to consciousness, is false. It's an absolute revolution. If his point of view was taken up, all of 99% of modern science would be turned on its head, frankly. So not surprisingly, no one's discussing his paper, except for a few who are already subscribing to this consciousness-based paradigm, like this Professor Tanzi and Deepak Chopra.
So what you're saying, Neville, is, if I'm right, is the idea of evolution, where consciousness is evolved over millions and billions of years from matter. You're saying it's exactly the opposite, that consciousness was always there and it's creating the matter.
Exactly, that's right.
So you're messing with our minds now, aren't you? That's quite hard to get your head around, isn't it?
It's hard to get our head around, it really is, because everything, from... Actually, they say that babies don't believe in the world that they can't see. If you, up to the age of about 9 months apparently, if you show a ball to a baby, it thinks it's there, but then if you hide it, it thinks it's gone. It doesn't understand hiding until much later. It just thinks that what it sees is reality. And we kind of learn to take this user interface. Maybe the baby is more accurate in its perception than we are. We learn to take this user interface very seriously, but it's the indication of this new paradigm, as explored by Professor Hoffman, is that actually, although you have to take it seriously, because if a train is thundering down a track towards you and you don't get out of the way, you'll soon realize that, that you have to take these user interfaces seriously. But they're there, the user interface and the signals you get are there to help consciousness negotiate this material world. So in fact, it's not the end of you when that train knocks you down. It's the end of that particular involvement with the game that you had through that body that was flattened by the train. It's very interesting. So next slide, please. So this is this is the essence of this idea that life has planted us in a universe of thoughts which we've mistakenly taken to be a universe of matter. The world which seems presented from outside to the senses is actually projected from within the mind. This is the core of this understanding. And that actually is consistent with ancient Eastern understandings that said that the material world is illusory, deeply illusory. The ancients went very deep into these things, and I think they may have come to some similar conclusions as these modern scientists who are now reaching these understandings through the depths of their examination of the material world. And that's the next bit in this presentation. Quantum theory, quantum mechanics. Some nearly 100 years ago, scientists found that when you get down to the very small, the level of molecules and atoms and subatomic particles, new laws come into operation that don't behave at all like classical physics of action and reaction. Laws where mind is intricately associated with how the material behaves or even exists. And quantum mechanics, in summary, again, because of the materialistic focus of 99% of science, they accept the findings of quantum theory and use them, use the maths to get precise predictions about how these matter will behave at this very refined level. It's these understandings that have permitted microprocessors, lasers, many other wonderful advances. But ask the scientists about the implications of quantum theory for our understanding of who we are, and they'll say it's a mystery. They say things like, anyone who says they understand quantum theory obviously doesn't, because they consider it such an irredeemable mystery. And they put it on one side out of consideration. But the argument of the post-materialist science is that actually it starts to be understood when you realize that mind is primary and the material world is secondary. So quantum mechanics, next slide please. Quantum mechanics, actually this is agreed, that quantum mechanics describes a world of possibilities from which consciousness makes choices, fixing reality. And the characteristics of a particle or wave have no reality until they are measured. This wave-particle duality is something quite fundamental in quantum theory. And I'm going to show now a little clip showing, it's from a film called What the Bleep, which came out a few years back. And Dr. Quantum is this cartoon character who very beautifully demonstrates something that is regarded as a huge mystery in science, this seeming interface between mind and matter at the level of the very small. And this double-slit experiment, as Dr. Quantum is going to be showing you, was voted by the readers of one leading physics journal as the most significant physics experiment of all time. So over to Dr. Quantum.
Here we are, the the infamous double-slit experiment. To understand this experiment, we first need to see how particles, or little balls of matter, act. If we randomly shoot a small object, say a marble, at the screen, we see a pattern on the back wall where they went through the slit and hit. Now, if we add a second slit, we would expect to see a second band duplicated to the right. Now, let's look at waves. The waves hit the slit and radiate out, striking the back wall with the most intensity directly in line with the slit. The line of brightness on the back screen shows that intensity. This is similar to the line the marbles make. But when we add the second slit, something different happens. If the top of one wave meets the bottom of another wave, they cancel each other out. So now, there is an interference pattern on the back wall. Places where the two tops meet are the highest intensity, the bright lines, and where they cancel, there is nothing. So, when we throw things, that is, matter, through two slits, we get this, two bands of hits. And with waves, we get an interference pattern of many bands. Good so far. Now, let's go quantum. An electron is a tiny, tiny bit of matter, like a tiny marble. Let's fire a stream through one slit. It behaves just like the marble, a single band. So, if we shoot these tiny bits through two slits, we should get, like the marbles, two bands. What? An interference pattern. We fired electrons, tiny bits of matter through. We get a pattern like waves, not like little marbles. How? How could pieces of matter create an interference pattern like a wave? It doesn't make sense. But physicists are clever. They thought maybe those little balls are bouncing off each other and creating that pattern. So, they decided to shoot electrons through one at a time. There is no way they can interfere with each other. But after an hour of this, the same interference pattern is seen to emerge. The conclusion is inescapable. The single electron leaves as a particle, becomes a wave of potentials, goes through both slits, and interferes with itself to hit the wall. But mathematically, it's even stranger. It goes through both slits and it goes through neither. And it goes through just one, and it goes through just the other. All of these possibilities are in superposition with each other. But physicists were completely baffled by this. So they decided to peek and see which slit it actually goes through. They put a measuring device by one slit to see which one it went through and let it fly. But the quantum world is far more mysterious than they could have imagined. When they observed, the electron went back to behaving like a little marble. It produced a pattern of two bands, not an interference pattern of many. The very act of measuring or observing which slit it went through meant it only went through one, not both. The electron decided to act differently. So it was aware it was being watched. And it was here that physicists stepped forever into the strange, never world of quantum events. What is matter? Bubbles or waves? And waves are matter. And what does an observer have to do with any of this? The observer collapsed the wave function simply by observing.
next slide, please. So when I first saw that, I was as confused as anyone else, and probably you are too. But the more I've learned about this new paradigm that says that in effect that what is going on here is that the quantum mechanics is describing this. They call it the superposition of possibilities. You may have heard that phrase from Dr. Quantum, where all these possibilities exist at once of where the electron might manifest if a conscious observer goes in and sees it. But until the conscious observer goes in and sees it, it doesn't exist. It's just even the wave is actually not a wave as such. It's a mathematical description. It's a wave-like range of possibilities of where you may find that particle. But the electron itself, the particle, doesn't actually exist until it's observed. And this is the core of the mystery of quantum mechanics as experienced by materialistic science. But post-materialistic science that puts the consciousness center stage does not experience such a mystery. So a few more bits and pieces. I promised you that I'd present various pieces of evidence. Don't expect to kind of get a full handle on these things. I really just want to let you know that a scientific revolution is underway, and it really is. So the mental universe. This is a paper actually appeared 10 years ago in Nature. No one picked up on it. Nobody discusses it. It's by a very leading professor, Richard Henry. He's a professor of mathematics and astronomy at Johns Hopkins University. The Nature magazine does not publish speculative articles. The subheading of his essay, "The only reality is mind and observations." But observations are not of things. To see the universe as it really is, we must abandon our tendency to conceptualize observations as things. And this starts to make sense when you connect it with discussions such as that by Deepak Chopra and Rudolf Tanzi of the paper that they referred to by Donald Hoffman. Donald Hoffman's paper explaining that whole system of how mind may be putting this story that we're experiencing in place with these very subtle mechanisms which we experience as material, as a kind of user interface to make it simple for us to negotiate this enormous drama of existence in which we find ourselves. Did that sentence make any sense? Hope so. No? Well, I couldn't say it again.
I was wondering, I mean, maybe we can take this up afterwards. I'm not sure if it's relevant now then, but how do we all experience the same universe then, or the same material reality?
It's because we are actually form a part of a unified consciousness.
Oh.
And this is actually relevant to another aspect of this, which is more kind of feeling-based, which I will come on to.
Okay.
Next slide, please. I'd just like you to know that there are other scientists who are supporting what Dick Henry has put forward in that paper from 10 years back. This is from Dr. Ron Garrett, who was a founder of Google, and he's a software engineer. He studied these issues. He's very clear on it. You can watch him speaking on these things on YouTube. The mathematics of quantum information theory tell us unambiguously that particles are not real. We are not physical entities, but informational ones. We're not made of atoms. We're made of quantum bits. A bit going back to that kind of computing idea. What we usually call reality is really a very high quality simulation running on a quantum computer. Now that's his speculation, but it's the kind of thing that the way that the science is moving. This is a very counterintuitive view of the world, but the maths of quantum mechanics tell us unambiguously that it is correct, just as the mathematics of relativity tell us that there's no absolute time and space. Enlightening as this new insight may be, it does leave us with the vexing question: if what we perceive as reality is only an illusion, what is the substrate for this illusion? If reality is a magic trick, who is the audience? Right, now we can move on a little bit further. Who are we? Da-da-da-da, yeah. Okay, but actually, just before that, I was really surprised to find, as I was kind of trying to find my way through this, that the founders of quantum theory, very, very big luminaries, the biggest names in science, have said pretty much the same thing. Look at this quote from Einstein. Next one, please. Everyone who is seriously involved in the pursuit of science becomes convinced that a spirit is manifest in the laws of the universe, a spirit vastly superior to that of man, and one in the face of which we with our modest powers must feel humble. Next slide, please. Max Planck, I lost a bit of that slide unfortunately, but Max Planck, considered the father of quantum mechanics. All matter originates and exists only by virtue of a force. We must assume behind this force is the existence of a conscious and intelligent mind. This mind is the matrix of all matter. This mind is the matrix of all matter. That's Max Planck. I've just come back from Germany. There are Planck institutes all across Germany. But how many people know that one of those founders, in fact several of those founders of quantum theory, were saying such revolutionary things? No one. It's all got swept under the carpet for the last 80 years. It's really strange. It's as if we just can't manage to face up to such revolutionary change of perspective. But other bits and pieces of evidence that have been coming forward which support this view. Next slide, please. This was a lovely book, and again, a TED talk was given. It's on YouTube by Jill Bolte Taylor, a brain scientist. She had a hemorrhage in her left hemisphere that shut down its function. And it was disconcerting as she kind of was trying to dial for help, and numbers had lost their meaning and so forth. But she moved into a realm of bliss. And in that bliss, she had this sense that she was a part of this organizing field, this matrix. She had a sense that she was that. You know, she was released from her brain into that zone which Max Planck and Einstein were referring to. The way she experienced it, part of it, was like this: I am the life force power of the universe. I am the life force power of the 50 trillion beautiful molecular geniuses that make up my form. She means the 50 trillion cells in the body, at one with all that is. And the next slide, please. This is a study that I like very much, just from the last, about 3 years ago, and it was done in Oxford, and it was with the drug psilocybin, which used to be known to the hippies of Wales, because it's the active ingredient in magic mushrooms. And these magic mushrooms would give you a trip. They would give the hippies apparently a blissful experience of going beyond into some kind of realm of bliss and peace. Love and peace, man, you know. And they got these experiences through the drug. And because of the concerns of the authorities about the drug culture in the 60s and 70s, there was a ban on research into these kind of things. But now that things are softening, because it's understood that consciousness is a hugely important subject, deserving of scientific study, the license to do these studies is coming through. These guys in Oxford, they gave measured doses of the drug to volunteers. They put them in fMRI, which is the brain scanning equipment that shows what's happening to your brain, what lights up, what shuts down as you're undergoing different experiences. Look at the results. They strongly imply that the subjective effects of psychedelic drugs are caused by decreased activity and connectivity in the brain's key connector hubs. You see, the scientists were looking which parts of the brain light up in response to this drug and produce this amazing experience, because they assumed that the brain produced the experience. But in fact, it's the brain shutting down. that produces the experience of release into some huge, widened, expansive consciousness.
We had a bit of a chat about this, didn't we, Neville? I shared with you that in my youthful hippie days I too had tried magic mushrooms and had a most profound experience where I felt I had died and I had left my body, and I had this amazing vision of Vishnu spinning on a lotus leaf, which I'd never seen before in my life. So it was really quite profound and extraordinary, but it was definitely an experience of going to another realm.
Going
completely.
to another realm.
Yeah, quite. And I remember thinking to myself, "Uh-oh, you've done it now. You took too much. You're going to die." But no, I didn't die, fortunately. But I did have some amazing insights. It was quite extraordinary.
It may have been one of the things that allowed Sarah to become such an insightful psychiatrist all her career. You know, because it's something I'm going to come on to. But it seems as if it's when we are aware of this deeper dimension that we're also more aware of the love within us. That's something I'm going to come on to more, but it's an important aspect. But I liked the final phrase in their summary, enabling a state of unconstrained cognition. You know, cognition means kind of what you're aware of and appreciating, and unconstrained cognition. So just scientific language for a trip. Amazing. The next one, please. Another one. This was became a bestseller recently, called Proof of Heaven. Another brain scientist, a neurosurgeon actually, and his frontal cortex was wiped out by a viral infection. He was in a coma for 10 days, and they thought they'd lost him, but he came back, and when he came back, he just wanted to get paper and write down these amazing experiences he'd had, because in this coma he'd gone somewhere else. And a summary of his experience: I was encountering the reality of a world of consciousness that existed completely free of the limitations of my physical brain. My experience showed me that the death of the body and the brain are not the end of consciousness. And that's actually something that, next slide please, that probably most of you are familiar with. Growing numbers of these studies of the near-death experience, as it's called, when thanks to modern resuscitation techniques, there are many instances now where people have died clinically. They've stopped breathing, there's no blood circulating, it can sometimes be shown there's no electrical activity in the brain, and then after some minutes, sometimes even longer, they're brought back, and quite commonly they have an amazing story to tell. It's come to be known as the near-death experience, although some people say it's actually an experience of death, which you then your consciousness happens to return to this previous user interface. And some of the quotes that people use are very similar to what Sarah described, what the psilocybin users described. Next slide, please. Here are some of them. The pinnacle of everything there is, of energy, of love especially, of warmth, of beauty. It seemed as if time and distance didn't exist. I was everywhere at once, and sometimes my attention was focused on something, and I was there too. So there's this sense that there's like, it's almost like if there's a kind of DVD of the whole, and normally we're experiencing it frame by frame, moment by moment, but somehow the whole also exists. And it's as if when we come out of a particular user interface or body, we go into this realm where we are connected to the whole of this conscious field. And the consciousness in that context feels connected to everything, but it's also able to zero in on particular things. So quite commonly, people who have these experiences say that they connect with, for example, long-lost relatives, things like this, because they're outside space and time. And those long-lost relatives are also conscious agents who are part of this huge energy of consciousness that is running this show. I like this one at the end. I think death is a really nasty, bad lie. So clear to that person, through this experience. Next slide, please. here's a summary. The best study that I've come across of these near-death experiences is by this Dutch cardiologist, Dr. PIM van Lommel. He did a study at 5 hospitals in Holland. They recruited 300 patients who died but were brought back. Slightly more than 60 of them had an experience that fitted this description of the NDE. And they were studied carefully. He had teams of psychologists and cardiologists questioning them when they'd been resuscitated and documenting the results. And this was his summary. He pulled it all together in an article in the Lancet Medical Journal originally, and then in this book called Consciousness Beyond Life, The Science of the Near-Death Experience. Enveloped by light, people experience total acceptance and unconditional love and have access to a deep knowledge and wisdom with indescribable clarity and insight. You see the commonality with all these experiences. Eben Alexander losing his frontal cortex, psilocybin shutting down those key connector hubs, Jill Bolte Taylor losing her left hemisphere, these people dying and losing their brain altogether temporarily. In all of them, it's not the end of them. They're moving into this realm where they know that death is a big, nasty, bad lie. It's a wonder. And now we've got a context in which it can be understood. But the mainstream guys who are really kind of, it's almost part of their ethic to stick to materialistic science, they, for good reasons, because they don't want, humanity's seen so many difficulties from superstitious and wild ideas, so science developed as a way of trying to get at the truth in a really solid, clear way. But you get over-wedded to a particular belief system. Pim van Lommel says that he met quite a lot of criticism from colleagues, cardiology colleagues, for writing his book and writing his article that was accepted by this top medical journal. But he said one of his patients told him that she had been to a conference on this subject and that he had addressed. And one of his cardiology colleagues had stood up and said, well, look, I've been a cardiologist for 40 years and no patient has ever told me of anything of the kind. I think you're talking a load of rubbish. Wow. And then this patient, who had been a patient of this cardiologist, stood up and said, Dr. So-and-so, I was your patient. You were a good doctor. You helped me a lot. But if I had told you about my experience, you would never have believed a word of it. So, he had a mindset that didn't allow him to listen to those things. So, here's just a nice little thing, enveloped by light, all of these experiences of light. Maybe, next slide, please. The Yoda knew all about it too. Luminous beings are we. This is the Yoda from Star Wars. I've always loved this beautiful image. Next slide, please. Eben Alexander, in his book, says love, this is his experience, absolutely unquestionable experience. Love is the basis of everything. Even though Donald Hoffman and the others who are trying to examine this in a scientific, rational way, deal with mechanics and mathematics and all the rest of it, and yet it's very interesting that it's the experience of unity, the experience that we are love, that there's a wholeness to this field when we go beyond the material, because the material can kill our love. When we're too identified with these bodies, with these user interfaces, if we get too identified with those and forget about this deeper dimension, it's as if the fear that comes in with that over-identification, fear of loss, friends, relatives, money, objects, the body itself, that fear can kill our love. But when you move into this different realm of understanding, love really reasserts itself and really comes to you. So I find that really, really important aspect. Next slide, please. On return, this is what one of the near-death experience people, many of them, by the way, in a follow-up study by PIM van Lommel, made big changes in their lives. On return, a single loving thought would let me be part of the whole again. And next slide, please. Marianne Williamson, I came across her book, A Return to Love, written 20 years back, based on her experience of some spiritual teachings called A Course in Miracles. And it's a beautiful book, and among her statements was this: the perfect you is the love within you. Closing our hearts destroys our peace. It's alien to our nature. Because thought is the creative level of things, changing our minds is the ultimate personal empowerment. I think that summarizes, in a way, the message behind all of this science. Because if you understand that thought, and especially loving thought, is the creative level of things, then you are on the first step towards freeing yourself of this paralyzing over-identification with the brain and your conditioning and your past and your body and its limitations. You're on the way towards experiencing that and bringing into your life that love that is associated with your deeper level of being. And because this is the Janki Foundation Lecture, here's a quote from Daddy Janki. Next one, please. This came from Daddy. Everything starts with the heart. As Daddy kind of speaks in terms of not really differentiating between soul and body, she sort of senses that the heart lies within the soul, but then it's expressed through the body. But the part that would be expressed through the body, the heart, would have equivalent feelings in the soul. Everything starts with the heart. The heart takes in sorrow, happiness and love, and harbours feelings. These feelings shape our attitude, our vision and our awareness. We have to clean up the heart by dealing with issues and feelings, taking what we need and placing a full stop to what we don't need. When the heart is true and clean, attitude and vision also become pure, and only then will the one remain in our awareness. So that kind of, for me, it's as if without needing any of this science, Daddy has intuitively and through deep introspection and through deep practice of positive, constructive thought, arrived at a place where she too knows that love is everything. You might think, last slide please. Oh no, stop. I'll just introduce it first. You might think that, all right, this all sounds very nice, lovey-dovey, love is the heart of everything, but nature red in tooth and claw, you know? Isn't nature harsh and difficult? Doesn't have to be. As quite a lot of slides show on the internet, and here's one of them. There are a lot of these things. There's pictures of foxes cuddling up with hens and all these kind of things. You know, it all depends on the circumstances. Anyway, that was it. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Neville. Very rich meal indeed, and just trying to get one's thoughts around it. And there's an opportunity now, if you have any questions that you'd like to ask, or experiences you'd like to share, or things you'd like to put to Neville. So just to recap while you're thinking. So Neville, you talked to us about post-materialistic science and the fact that thoughts, the scientists know that thoughts do change brain structures, but they don't know how. But really this feeling that consciousness is the ground of being, and that's something that's been said by, you know, several very high ranking and historic scientists whose science we trust, but we've somehow ignored the philosophical aspects of what their conclusions were. So this really strong feeling come through that we are conscious agents, and there's a mind-like quality to the universe, and this idea of the user interface. I found that example you gave of how when we think we're dragging things into the delete bin of the computer. I think that's quite helpful because, as you say, that's what we think we're doing, but actually what's going on in the computer is something completely different. But we wouldn't be able to use it if we were faced with thousands of zeros and noughts and ones in digital binary sequences. We wouldn't know how to use it. But so the illusion is useful, I guess. It's necessary, but it's also misleading, I think, is what you're saying. But again, I guess the mind is the matrix of all matter. So this question of how do we have individual experiences, like you said, that tied somehow, we have individual experiences, but how do we have the same experience of reality, like that both you and I assume are seeing this table or this glass of water?
Yes.
And also the other question on my mind was, sometimes, especially in Brahma Kumari's philosophy, we talk about the self being a point. And mathematically a point is very interesting as well because it is dimensionless. And also, I think, can be dimensionless but also infinite. It has this strange property. So I just wondered about your own churnings on the sense of individuality but also shared reality, and how you think that happens.
Well, I can partly answer your question, or at least, with where my own thought is going on the subject, and that is with this aspect of the shared reality that we have. It seems that this, they call it a field of consciousness. It's not actually. It's not necessarily a field as such. It seems to all originate from that dimensionless point, and from that dimensionless point, or within that dimensionless point, there is connectedness between everything. So deep reality is that everything is one. It's all connected in there. It's like a seed that has all the potential of the tree, but it's all held in that one seed. And what seems to be the case is that as the seed develops and consciousness differentiates, and we become these individualized conscious agents who have these different roles in the play that we're projecting, we have that sense of individuality. And that's real, but it's not experienced when or not necessarily experienced, if we allow our minds to become free of the extension and to return to the source. It's as if we're able to go back to that sense of deep connectedness, where we feel that we are a part of a whole, and yet also that individuality is there, but it's as if it's submerged when we are completely beyond, in that singularity, as they call the dimensionless point. So it's something to do with coming from that point, and it may be a kind of parallel to the Big Bang theory that is currently the orthodox science, that the entire physical universe originated at a dimensionless point, the singularity. And there may be a kind of, this may be true, and a kind of, there may be a sort of spiritual parallel to that this is what mind is doing. Mind originally was in that point, but then it projects this movie that we call the material world, and we are individualized within that, and yet the deeper reality is that we're one. And that's why love seems to be such an ultimate truth, even though when we're out here in the divided world, we have to do things as if we are individual. I hope that may help a little bit. The other speculation I have in this area, which is supported by some of this science, is that it's rather like Jung thought. The consciousness is there are universal aspects of consciousness, and there are individual aspects of consciousness. So this may explain why many different species share similar genes, similar DNA. The differences between species in their DNA inheritance are surprisingly small. And this may be because the DNA is also a projection of consciousness, not so that the field of consciousness, or this ground of being, holds information that can be common to many different species and common to many different conscious agents. So, for example, the user interface that allows me to see red is shared by you. You have the same user interface, and that's why you also can feel pretty confident that you're seeing red, and we both know what that means. And similarly with many other experiences, it's because we don't create, it's not our individual brains that create that experience of red, it's because consciousness itself creates it, and we are part of consciousness, therefore we have that shared experience.
Okay. I'd like it thank you, Neville. My brain is beginning to hurt a bit. It's a funny kind of world, isn't it? When you're trying to understand it,
yes.
it can feel more complex than it needs to. But anyone else like to ask a question? We do have a roving mic. Or any comments?
Very well tonight.
Here's someone here.
Yeah, thank you very much for the talk. It was a brain twister. But we're talking about consciousness shaping reality, right? So your consciousness therefore creates your reality. So we all have our own consciousness, which has been shaped by our parents, our society, our education, our background, and so forth. And then it shapes our reality, which may not necessarily be the reality which we want to make us happy. Are we saying then, I mean, is there a conflict between the brain and the consciousness then? How can we marry up the ideas that you've brought forth tonight?
One of the problems is that consciousness is used in different ways. One thing is conscious awareness, like the
But is that drives the brain, does it? I mean, just trying to link up the two.
I'll try and express the difference between these usages of consciousness. One is conscious awareness, like I'm conscious, if you hit me on the head with a hammer, I become unconscious. I'm consciously awake or I'm asleep. So that conscious awareness is one thing, and then consciousness is also used in this deep sense of the mind-like quality to this universe. Close to probably, I haven't studied Jung, but Carl Jung, the great psychologist, had this concept of a universal unconscious. And so, yes, there is to answer your question more specifically, there is a conflict between the consciousness we find ourselves with that is contributed to by the conditioning in our brains, and this original consciousness which is so loving and which we re-experience when we become free of our brains through the variety of things that I've been speaking of tonight, including death. So the question is, how can we bypass, if we feel that the conditioning of our consciousness by our brains is not always helpful to us, and of course a lot of it is helpful. The brain, in this different way of thinking, is like a filter. If we had all of this undifferentiated, huge ocean of consciousness pushing in on our individual consciousness at every minute of the day, life would be completely impossible. And in fact, some forms of mental illness, so when the filter is not working properly, and all sorts of voices crowd in, very distressing to the individual. So this concept of the filter is helpful, and a good brain will serve this purpose very well, and enabling you to interface with this material world accurately. A problem does arise when we have tendencies built into our brains as a result of the experiences that you've spoken of, in conflict with these deeper, very positive tendencies. And what I've learned, as Daddy Janki's quote indicated, is that taking great care with my thought to keep it aligned with the divine, and to keep experiencing that, and to try to bring that more and more into everything that I do, helps me more and more to bypass the conditioning in my brain, which is sometimes of a negative kind. So I hope that's some help to your question. It's a good question.
It's a big challenge. Yeah, thank you.
Well, I think that was sort of relates to what I was thinking, because in a sense, what is the point of spiritual endeavour? And as you say, you're not going to go around having brain damage or taking drugs or whatever to get that experience, but the whole point of the spiritual endeavour is to reconnect with that deeper truth. Yeah. And all the practices, the meditation, the understanding, the wisdom, is to help you to see behind the illusion, isn't it?
Yes, because that's very liberating. You know, we get so upset when we defined ourselves as this limited being, which inevitably gets challenged, and it grows old, and it dies, and it loses people and things, and we get so upset by that. If we're to understand that we're not that, that's a huge help in experiencing the peace and love man that seem to lie behind the scenes.
Yes, yes. Okay, I think we've got time for another question. There was someone else who had their hand up. Was there? In the middle? There, at the back.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask if you're saying we're sharing the same interface, that's why we're seeing the same reality. Part of the question you've answered already. I just wanted to know how it relates to, say, other situations like psychics or people who are schizophrenic, or different people, or people that say, you know, spirituality we've just discussed. And so really that's what I wanted to know with different people, how this consciousness and the same interface actually, what we think of it.
We differ in our access to the deeper realm of consciousness. Some individuals are too open to that deeper realm, and there are both negative and positive goings on in that deeper realm, and so that's also important to distinguish between those. In Raja Yoga, we learn to connect with what we understand as a source of the highest energy of love and peace. So that guides us in the renewal of our own consciousness. But certain forms of mental illness, as I said, you know, other things crowd in on the person's consciousness and they can't seem to free themselves of it. But some people have, the filter is not as tight and excluding as normal, and they're able to see much more than average. You know, people like Edgar Cayce, the great 19th century healer, he seemed to be amazing in the way he could even just be told about someone, given their name, or speak to them briefly, and he would have an image of their energy form and where there were blocks, and could actually diagnose at a distance. And there are other healers who can do this. But of course, because of the materialistic paradigm that doesn't acknowledge this matrix of information, these things are written off as impossible or as scams or frauds, but they seem to really be real. Same with clairvoyants, who sometimes are able to actually glimpse the future. And actually that's not so, part of one of the implications of relativity theory is that space and time are not as we thought they were, that there's more like this whole DVD, you know. So some minds seem able to jump forward and bring information to us in the present moment from a different part of the DVD, and that seems to be how clairvoyance can work. And telepathy is another one where, very often where there's a love link, in a way that is completely inexplicable to materialistic science. A mother may know that her son, who's on the other side of the world, is in deep trouble in a car accident or something like that. She feels she's got to get on the phone and find out what's happened. So all of these things which have been written off as mysteries or, just things that are unscientific, actually they all have a place within this consciousness-based paradigm.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Neville. I think you've, as they say, given us plenty of food for thought, and I hope you haven't got indigestion. But these are very complex ideas, and trying to marry the science with the spiritual truths is it's not easy, and I think we really appreciate your efforts to try and make sense of this and to join up the dots and really understand what different people are saying and how they relate to this new way of understanding how science and consciousness are really explaining each other, really,
Yes.
and also what we're trying to do in spiritual endeavour.
Yes.
Why we're really trying to get behind the veil of our normal mind and access something much deeper and more profound in our real true natures. So thank you very, very much for being brave in tackling this subject, because I think not many would dare. And I think we all appreciate it, haven't we? We have. That's great. What I've been asked to do at this point is something completely different, as they say, and now for something completely different, but maybe not. It's to just do a short reflection. So we'll do a little meditation to just absorb those ideas and perhaps even experience some of what Neville was speaking about. So I'll just invite you to join us on an inner journey, and I will speak some thoughts to guide us. So generally when we start, we just relax the body so it's not distracting us. So just get comfortable, taking a few deep breaths, letting your shoulders drop and your knees and your legs relax. Just start by becoming aware of your breath. Just the slow, gentle rhythm of the in-breath and the out-breath. This focuses my attention on myself. And then the screen of my mind. I can observe the traffic of thoughts going past. There may be thoughts about the day or things I've heard or what I need to do tomorrow. But behind and beneath the busyness of my mind, I slip gently between the space of my thoughts. I sense behind my thoughts there is a deep silence. And I go into this silence. And it's a feeling of peace and stillness. It's like I'm floating on a sea of peace, so light, so calm. And the deeper I go into that experience, I sense my true nature of love. A benevolent, kind, sweet energy. This is the core of my essence, the seed of my being. A point that connects with the universe of love. That knows the source of love. And resonates with that. This is my deepest truth. It needs no words. And it connects with all the other souls of the universe in a united frequency of silent love. And I touch this reality with my thoughts and know it is always there as I come back out into the world of things and matter and others. But I carry this energy, this intention, this truth with me. Om Shanti.